I'd love to welcome Caitlin, Jim, and Christy to the conversation live for some discussion and Q&A. Caitlin, Jim, and Christy, are you here? Good afternoon. Really inspired by all of your stories about the successes that you've had, and honestly what is a really challenging undertaking is to improve traceability in the supply chain. We get brought up with this often at the Pet Sustainability Coalition. I know Caitlin can speak to that even more extensively. So I was wondering if you could actually tell us a story, now that we've highlighted everything that's gone well, about maybe a time that something that didn't go so well and you got a little bit stuck, and how you overcame that and what kind of lessons learned were from that. I'd love to start with you, Jim, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's been lots of examples of that along the way. What we found when we got started was how could we actually find the opportunities, and really when we got stuck with some of the physical pieces. If this comes through okay. Yeah, we really you can find the farmers. I have a few of those folks around that I know, but getting those actual ingredients out of location can be quite difficult. And so what we found was actually we go meet with some of the slaughter plants, and they'd say, we'd love to help you. We know those producers. We'd like to work with you. We physically can't do this. And it was just, it was a place where we kept getting hung up with some of the smaller regenerative plants that we went to at first. And what we did to persevere was just kind of sit and continue to work through what would work. And, we could just dream about it and talk on the side. And then slowly, often they basically could figure everything out. But it was actually just stopping and taking the space with them, because people are so busy in their lives and what they're focused on. So to me, that was really the one we'd run into all the time, until we figured out you had to give that space for someone who actually knows more than I do about their own process and plant, to just think through it out loud with them was the way we did it, if that helps to answer.
That this might not have been the easiest or most successful of journey. Have you ever gotten stuck? Has this been smooth sailing from the get-go?
Oh my goodness, no, it has not been smooth sailing at all. Not at all, actually. I've been doing this for 10 years, and it's never smooth sailing at all. But that's okay, because challenges is what makes us work harder, and we're in this for the long term. So there are way too many stories to share on that front. If you want to pick a topic, I'm happy to dive into one topic, but there's a lot.
I've been working with a supplier, for example, who didn't want to provide a level of transparency, or the data was just too difficult to track down, or something like that. Yeah, no,
that's common in what we're doing. So there's one example, and I don't know if you guys are getting feedback. I'm getting feedback, but I'll just roll with it. So there was one time where we were working with a sorghum supplier, and he wasn't willing to give us the transparency we needed, so we actually left. And in the process, we had to work with someone who we weren't that thrilled about, but going forward, it's actually going to be a fantastic thing for Quinn. So that was a difficult end to that relationship, but overall, we've had challenges, but we've always worked through them with our growers and our suppliers, and nothing's ever perfect. We're totally not perfect. We're learning as we go.
I know this hasn't been a easy journey for you. Can you talk about kind of a lesson learned that we've gotten from PSC's point of view at some time?
Sure. So Melissa, I apologize. There's a delay between when you ask questions. If you could repeat your question, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Caitlin, sorry. I was saying that I know that this hasn't always been perfectly smooth sailing from PSC, so I can wonder if you would share with our audience a time that we came up with a challenge that you weren't expecting, and maybe a lesson learned from that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So from PSC's perspective, this has been a really interesting journey because we didn't have that much information headed into it. We find traceability and transparency to be really difficult in our industry. And so when we headed out, we had a direction we wanted to go, but we had no idea what was going to happen along the way. So it's been an enormous process just learning, things like the terminology of what ingredients are, how they're classified, what they're called by suppliers, but then what they're called on the bag. And then there's all these tightly held opinions and beliefs in our industry about what's good and what's bad and what's healthy and what's not. And so kind of wading through all of these emotional responses or predetermined decisions that we all think we know what the best thing is for pets or the best thing for the environment, and really being committed to going back to the science and really understanding how we create this holistic approach and honor where the industry is at today and learn the best ways to leverage our position as a sustainable organization that's bringing all these stakeholders to the table and really being invested in collaboration, but also not really knowing who the players are or who wants to be at the table or who's open to change and who isn't. And so we're really early on in this journey. We've been doing this for about 1.5 years now. So we feel like we've got a ton to learn. And just recently we kind of decided, hey, we headed down this path without really doing a landscape review of who are all the players here, and what is their leverage in the supply chain, and who's interested in having a different conversation, or where do we need growth? What's holding back demand? What's holding back supply? And so we're really just taking a step back in some ways too, to better understand the landscape from which we're working in, so that we can leverage our position as best as possible. I also just want to add, because it's really fun, that I'm having a bowl of popcorn here today, and all of you in your event boxes hopefully got some lovely snacks as well. And Jim, I was looking at purchasing, because the regenerative holiday guide just came out last night, and I was perusing and I saw some Timberlands in there, but I didn't have time to order any, so you got to get me the hookup.
I would love to. Unfortunately, this year they only released the men's version in the US. But if you have friends in Canada or other parts of the globe, there are women's boots available. I have had to do that for my own wife and some of the women we work with at the slaughter plants. So.
All right, thanks for that.
All of my friends up at Open Farm and Glenn and Pet Curian up in Canada, I'm looking at you guys. We need some boots. That transitions great into our next question that I'd love to start with you, Jim. When we're looking at like strategic partnerships, trying to expand transparency, how would you recommend to a company starting this journey how to find some partners? I'm assuming Timberland didn't just come knocking on your door someday.
Not quite. It was through relationships and networking. I mean, this is really how it works. It's great to hear all the work that's happened here on sustainable packaging and stuff like that. I actually did a lot of green chemistry work from the bio-based perspective earlier, and it turned out that I had a consultant friend who was working with Timberland reach out to me about some toxic contamination issues with agriculture, I'll just say. And we talked about it a bit, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him, and he said, "I was just sitting with someone from Timberland who's really excited about regenerative." So they kind of did, to be honest, but it's about networks, it's about these relationships within the same space, I think, which is key. And I think that's where I would recommend other folks. You probably know some people already in the space where you could start to push back on these push to the relationships, to some of the traceability at the different stages. And so I say you don't have to, I mean, we're always happy to talk to new people. That's a good way, but look in your own networks first, I'd say.
Love that. You've got a great network here, ladies and gentlemen. Christy, I saw you nodding. So often the problem, especially when we start talking about organic and regenerative, is you're creating systems and doing things that haven't been done before. So how did you go about finding partners, building a network?
Sure. So we were actually pretty lucky about 10 years ago when I started Quinn, and I was frustrated about the lack of transparency in our industry. We were connected with Grain Place Foods in Nebraska and Dave Vetter. And that was after 6 months of me trying to find someone to source organic popcorn kernels from. And that was a Google search. It was purely just Google search and wild goose chase. And then Dave answered one day, and the rest is history. And he's been an amazing partner of ours since day one. But I think it really, to Jim's point, it's all about who's in your network, and it is about trying to connect with others and ask the questions, and then one person leads to another and another and another, and then ultimately you find yourself with a partner. We also worked with Mad Ag, who I had known for a while, and we'd always wanted to work with them, but that was, again, like after 4 years of wanting to do something with Phil Taylor and his group, the time was right, and we were looking for a sorghum grower to grow about 85 to 100 acres of sorghum using regenerative ag practices, and he was able to connect us with someone in Nebraska. So it doesn't happen overnight. It definitely takes some time, and then as a small company, bandwidth has always been a challenge for us. So we have to kind of cross that bridge as well. But no, I mean, I really agree with networking, and then just seeking and looking and asking those questions is kind of how this all happens.
Well, and shout out to Nebraska.
Yes.
And you couldn't do much better than Dave Vetter, personally. Like you could in the whole world. So you did great in your first sourcing.
100%. Our universe has definitely collided there in a perfect moment. And he actually packed our microwave popcorn boxes for years. So the only reason we're here is that he took that chance and risk on us. So he was our first manufacturer.
And I only bring him up because my parents and him, I mean, they're the sustainable and organic world of Nebraska, as you may guess, at least 20 years ago was not too large. So the Vetters are dear family friends of ours.
That's awesome, Jim.
Jim can attest to this. We actually had some crazy Nebraska love on our Midwestern forum yesterday. So make sure you're all sticking around for the forums after this. Caitlin, I'd love to pose that question to you from kind of a dual perspective. You mentioned some of the partners that PSC is working with, from University of Iowa to University of Guelph. How did you go about identifying those partners on behalf of PSC, but then also from a different point of view, from pet food brands or manufacturers or co-packers who want to be finding ways to collaborate with each other? I'm sure you've got some ideas of how they could do that, both within PSC and maybe beyond as well.
Yeah, great question. So to find external partners, a lot of it has to do with being in these spaces, right? So Boulder happens to be a hub of progressive ag practices. They host the Regenerative Forum and have for the last several years. And ensuring, that as a leader of this movement, that I'm in those spaces, that I see as these things are popping up and there are brands coming together and there are suppliers coming together. I met Jim at that meeting. I met Dr. Bronner's. I met Timberland. Timberland came and spoke at Impact Unleashed last 2 years ago. It's really about staying abreast of what are these movements, how are we moving beyond sustainability and into regenerative, and who are the players who are at that table, and how do I bring those people into the pet industry? The pet industry has such enormous opportunity, and Jim, I hope you get to talk about this, but one of the things you talked about is that we need to, make it worth a rancher's time or a farmer's time in order to create transparency and traceability. And so there's a big role to play for the pet industry to start increasing the value for these ranchers and farmers who are willing to do things differently. When you think about internally other companies in the industry and what our plans are to really engage them, we have put together an entire concept around what we're calling the Protein Collaborative, which is a multi-stakeholder platform for small and large companies to come together, and that includes producers and suppliers and brands and retailers and distributors all together around this issue, so that we have all of those perspectives at the table. If there's not ranchers and farmers and producers at the table when you're having these conversations, then you're going to create a solution that doesn't represent their perspective, and it's going to take you 10 years longer to get to where you need to be. And the same is true with brands. If you don't have brands at the table who are willing to support farmers and the rest of the supply chain going through this process, then they don't see the market signal that if they make these choices, there will be a financial payout for them and their livelihood. And retailers too, right? We've got consumers asking us tons of questions around traceability. Our trust is not great in this industry. And so we need retailers at the table too, so that we can educate consumers as we head in this direction together and make sure that they're on board to support the brands, to support the suppliers, to support the producers all the way through.
That just another reason to stop by the PSC booth at the exhibit hall if you haven't already done already to find out how you can get involved. Caitlin, in your presentation, you did a really good job of kind of laying out where we are in our strategic mapping and where we go from here. But I'd love to ask both Jim and Christy, kind of now that you've achieved this level of transparency in your supply chain, what's next as far as kind of traceable ingredients or healthy food systems or byproducts of food systems like leather?
Christy, you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So we haven't achieved. It's interesting because this is not a definitive of efforts here. I mean, we're always seeking to do better, and I think that's kind of it started with our farm to bag transparency policy. And we were never satisfied with just being transparent. Yes, like transparency is a fundamental right. And as consumers, we should all know where our food is grown. And as manufacturers, we definitely need to know this, right? But it was never, I was never satisfied with just being transparent, which led us to our Be Better, Do Better initiative. And I'm hopeful that that will lead us to something else. But it's this constant quest to again, just to do better in everything that we're doing and pushing our growers and challenging others to do things differently. So there's a lot of things that we're working on right now, and who knows what this will look like 5 or 10 years from today. But I'm hoping that this will evolve into something different.
Thanks, Christy. And for us, I mean, I think this is just the beginning of the other half for us. I mean, our goal from the beginning was really to see how we bring more of the value and the respect back, right? The whole utilization, the whole evaluation of that animal for all the work that the ranchers, farmers, the communities that raise them do. So for us, the hides were a great first opportunity, but we've always seen the rest of the other half, the parts and the byproducts, especially that could be used for proteins, just to the point. We know traceability has been one of the biggest issues with byproducts in the sector. And we think that's one of the things we can do is to bring the confidence back if you have that. But mostly it's about, again, reestablishing and starting with the idea that this is not a high value market that's just something that farmers and ranchers have to jump over to get into a market. It's not regenerative if they're not getting a direct benefit. And so for us, the fact that Timberland and others can say a farmer rancher got exactly this many dollars back for the boots you're wearing, and we're going to do the same thing with all the other byproducts, because our value proposition starts and ends with the producer relationship. And if we can continue to bring more value in, then we know that's the pull that helps with the exactly kind of stuff Christy's talking about, to help pull that transition across the landscape that we all need. But it's not regenerative if the buyer isn't doing their part. We ask so much of the producers. We feel that you have to incorporate it. And I think it has to be asked of everyone. If you're going to do regenerative, what's the benefit? So I love what you guys have done at PSC, everything you guys have talked about through here. Oh, and then the last piece is, we aren't taking the people who come. We're very focused on BIPOC. We're very focused on racial justice issues. We know this is exactly where the rubber hits the road historically around agriculture, where a lot of people have been disadvantaged, and it shows up with their lack of access to land and resources. And so we are very focused on bringing in young, beginning, Black, Native, and other producers and working with them as much to bring the value back to their communities. So.
Conversations today has been how interconnected all of these issues are, right? So I want to invite my colleague, Andy Gale, who's been checking in on the audience and the chat box. Andy, what questions does our audience have for these amazing speakers?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, there's not a ton of questions out there, but first there were definitely some shout outs about Quinn popcorn. And I'm sure many folks were enjoying some of that popcorn from their box of goodies that they got. A lot of the questions related around getting buy-in, whether it's from the supplier or up chain into the producers. So, for example, if you're looking at, say you've developed a traceability system, how might you get pet food manufacturers to embrace that kind of change? Any thoughts there?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think that when we started Quinn, there was this idea in the industry, and it still exists clearly, but a lot of smaller brands like us, when you're going into creating a product line, you're going to that manufacturer and they're sourcing everything and they're doing all of it. I'm assuming that's kind of the same thing in the pet world and the pet industry. The challenge that we had was we couldn't do it that way because we wanted to know exactly where our ingredients were coming from. And so we stepped in and said, no, we're going to purchase everything and we're going to send it to you guys to manufacture. That was, I think, in the beginning was definitely not really that heard of. Everyone kind of pushed back on us on that. I mean, not to mention, like, you know, our cash now is tied up in inventory and there's a lot of complexity around that. So we definitely took a chance there, but it really set the stage for who we were, what we were trying to do, that we were doing things differently. And then ultimately, you know, over time, 10 years later, we do that with all of our manufacturers. And then right now, we tell them what they can and cannot purchase. So we have approved suppliers and specs and everything around that. But I think it's really, I would say that that's probably the biggest hurdle that we had in the beginning, but it set ourselves up to source from who we wanted to source and have those questions with those ingredient suppliers. So I would say that would be your first step, is push back on that if you can.
Okay, great. One question came through. What examples of traceability and maybe almost an accreditation type that exist in other industries that you think might be able to be applied here in the pet space?
Jim, do you want to jump in? I can.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I guess to us, this was partly why we didn't find it quite so daunting, and maybe we were just naive, is because we come at it from the organic and natural space already, where we did custom meat. The whole point is ID preserve. Like when we do organic greens, everything, right? Christy knows. Like it's so important to keep that traceability in space. So for us, I guess I just look to agriculture, honestly, and underneath, if you look at specialty agriculture in particular, the level of traceability is extraordinary. The tools are there. The value needs to transfer to make that work. So I think the question is back up: are you willing to pay for traceability?
Mm-hmm.
I can answer that a little bit from my perspective as well. And in all of my slides, I kind of went through what the standards are in each of the different 4 categories that we consider when evaluating sustainability. And there definitely isn't just one holistic way to know for sure. And I know that the regenerative community is working on a regenerative standard, which is kind of an expansion of the organic standard. And I think, you know, both organic and B Corp certified are really the most well-known certifications out there. There are tens of thousands of them. And so I think there's some debate as to whether or not a certification or another standard is needed. But we do know that we need to have a way in the pet industry to evaluate suppliers. Right now, it seems pretty commonplace for a supplier just to say, sorry, I'm not telling you my specs because that's proprietary information. And that is totally not acceptable, right? That does not increase transparency or traceability in our supply chain. And so we need to start shifting that conversation and the expectation for what types of transparency are required in order to do business in this industry. And so the Pet Sustainability Coalition is working really hard to figure out, you know, how do we get more suppliers in this industry at the table? We have a lot of brokers that go in between different suppliers. And, you know, Jim, I think what you've kind of done is you've looked at a broken supply chain for leather and you just kind of went out and said, I'm going to create a different one. Because in a lot of ways, the leather supply out there that's not regenerative is really hard to navigate. And so these new players came to the market and they had hides, right? And so you got to create this, and not to say that it wasn't an enormous job, because I know this is one of the hardest supply chains to manage, but you kind of decided you're going to go around them, right? You're like, I'm not going to work in this system. I'm going to create a new system. And so I think it'll be interesting as a pet industry to say, you know, are there suppliers that are rising up that can supply this industry at a quantity that's needed? And so we'll be able to create supply elsewhere, or are we going to have to work with the existing suppliers to really start to build common ground and to let them know that there is a market when they're ready to and open-minded to change?
Yeah, Can I respond to that? Because that's a great point, Caitlin. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's an and. It really is. I think you're right. I mean, thank you for that. I mean, we had to recreate a supply chain because it had disappeared, right? What we have is two very different systems. We have the largest system that has continuous flow, as it were, right? So the idea of traceability was never part of it. It was about homogeneity, right? It was never about trying to break it apart. Meanwhile, we have these smaller systems that have always supported the regenerative, organic, direct to farm or direct to customer kind of things, custom. So we had a system in place that does all the traceability. It just wasn't the big guys. And now what we're finding is, just to your point, those people are starting to identify that this is a value proposition. It's not just that custom meat or whatever they've been doing for that one farm customer or meat company. It's literally, we have some other values if we can figure out how to keep the attributes and the story, because that's what we really provide, as does Christy, the story back to the farm or ranch. And that's a value proposition. And I think the bigger companies and processors, I will be honest, are starting to see that they may be missing something there. In their system design. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. But I appreciate that the smaller ones are actually the ones who are able to start and pull, because they have the opportunity in their process and they have the value proposition there for them much more directly than the largest processors.